You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I am Dustin and I am here with Tony, and we are here to bring you an extra episode while we are on our holiday break for Christmas and New Year's. We are here to discuss something that just randomly popped up across our desks over the past couple days. So we've been plotting out what topics we're going to cover. And interestingly, this was not one that we were planning on covering because it wasn't even something we were aware of. We recorded one of the extra episodes and this popped up the next day, and immediately as Tony and I were discussing it online, we realized this was something that we really needed to discuss as one of our extra podcasts, because it brings up a lot of different smaller discussion points, at least the three that I know that we're going to hit on today. Let me give you a little of a back history. So if you're unfamiliar with how the cable industry has been going, at least here in the United States, and I imagine this is across the world, not just a United States problem, but if you're unfamiliar with how the cable industry is currently dealing with change, it's not very well, and they are experiencing a lot of problems. AT&T is specifically experiencing a lot of losses when it comes to subscribers for DirecTV, and even their Uverse system that they have, which is more cable based, less and not having anything to do with satellite. But they spent an exorbitant amount of money for DirecTV and as a satellite provider, and as time has progressed, it has become extremely expensive to keep that as a service. But then in addition to that, it also has become bothersome because they're losing money through the service that they spent a ton of money acquiring. So there's that. One of the things that AT&T constantly is pushing whenever we talk about HBO Max is that HBO Max is the future of what they're trying to accomplish, and what they're doing with HBO Max should make up a lot of the difference of what they've been losing with DirecTV and things like that as far as revenue goes. Now, there are other companies out there like Comcast, who's currently working on creating Peacock as their own streaming service to use content that they have between the media library that they have with NBC Universal, because they purchase NBC Universal. But other than AT&T and Comcast, all the other cable companies don't have an extensive media library that they have access to. Everything that they have has to be licensed if they were going to create any sort of streaming service. That's not the case. The big players, of course, in cable are Comcast and AT&T, if for no other reason than they have a lot of other things outside of just cable and broadband. The reality of it is the other cable companies are feeling just as much pressure as Comcast and AT&T, potentially on just a smaller scale, but that doesn't mean as a company they're not hurting as well with subscribers leaving the service. They are all hurting because all subscribers are realizing that as more streaming services release, there's better content that is not nearly as expensive elsewhere, and they're looking at cheaper options. The cable industry as a whole has become a very bloated service, and for the longest time, the cable companies have gotten away with having basically what some might describe as monopoly, but unfortunately the US government does not state that it's a monopoly. But the reality is that a lot of these companies have gotten away with making tons and tons of money for multiple decades, and now they're just starting to feel pressure about not making them because of not making as much money as they have in the past. So that's bad, especially for a lot of these companies that are public. So that leads us to our discussion point today, which is there was an earnings call for the company behind Spectrum Charter, and the CEO, Tom Rutledge, he specifically said that there's the main reason as to why cable companies are losing subscribers is due to password sharing. That's right. It has nothing to do with anything else but password sharing. I'm going to read a specific quote that he said, and then we're going to discuss kind of the quote and the idea of password sharing be a problem for the cable industry, as well as some other things. So the quote says, "Streaming products have been sold with 5 streams and with no location-based kind of security. Most households in the United States have 2 or less people enroll in them. And as a result of that, there are more streams than there are households available for free. And by sharing passwords and by not having location-based or subscriber-based relationship with those streams, and the fact that TV Everywhere allows for massive numbers of streams replicated through virtual MVPDs and so forth, it's just too easy to get the product without paying for it. So this was on his third quarter earnings call that he specifically said that the streaming services were having problems. He specifically did not call out any specific streaming service, but one of the streaming services that most recently launched would be Disney Plus, which allows 4 devices to stream at one single time. In addition to that, you've got Netflix, where you can have multiple streams depending on the number or depending on the tier that you're at. And then there's also the live TV options as far as Hulu and YouTube TV and PlayStation View, which is going out of business, Fubo TV. There's a ton of services out there, but the main group of those also allow you to use your service in a variety of different locations. I believe Hulu is the only one that you have to use it in your home network in order to access the live TV aspect of it, but the rest of them all have, you can basically use it wherever. And password sharing is something that we've talked about before on the podcast. But I guess the question I want to present immediately is password sharing really the main reason as to why cable companies, or let me rephrase that, password sharing, is it a cable company issue as far as it's hurting them, or is it really a situation that could be hurting the streaming services themselves, as we've discussed in the past?
Obviously, password sharing will hurt the streaming providers, like Netflix and stuff like that, because you're losing the opportunity, these companies losing the opportunity to gain a subscriber, instead of just password sharing. It's like, well, why don't you just subscribe and we'll take your money? Same thing. It's the same premise of, like bootlegging, videos or whatnot. So instead of HBO making money on, DVD sales or, their subscription sales for like a Game of Thrones, people just pirated it, and HBO was missing on, that money, that kind of like opportunity costs. And so that makes sense. We've had that argument before, we've had that discussion before, and we've hit the high points, but I think that's pretty obvious of, the streaming companies are missing out on this opportunity cost. And so it makes sense that they want to crack down on this. Now, they haven't figured out a good solution yet, but, they're working on it. To answer your question, I answered like the first part of it. Now I'm going to answer the first part about the cable companies. We have to make a distinction now between these cable companies, so you got like a Charter Spectrum thing going on. And then you have the sub businesses of these major players like AT&T and Comcast. So they have like their cable units, but they also have broadband, and that's offset. That's a different business as well. So I think local cable companies, right, just companies that just focus on cable and that delivery, service are being affected. Yes, because people are dropping their service in terms of going for streaming, and that is fair. I think that take on life has already been discussed, and that makes sense. Now we get the question of like, AT&T, a Comcast, Charter, these companies that have a cable side of the business and a broadband side of their business. And I think that, yes, these the cable units are decreasing in revenue. I think that is true. I think that's a statement that makes sense. But I don't think that means that, AT&T, Comcast, Charter, etc., is going to lose market share. And it's because I think that, revenue will shift from one place to another. I think that revenue is going to be, or should be, captured by the broadband units, right? Because, the streaming services and these broadband companies, you can include like wireless carriers at the same time, anyone that like serves you your internet, right? There's going to be a symbiotic relationship between those two companies, because I want streaming content, but how does streaming content get to you? It's got to come through a fiber line or a cell phone tower, stuff like that. So these companies there's a relationship between the two. And in the advent of the streaming wars, quote unquote, our name, there's going to be a lot more streaming services out there, which means that I think already there's going to be more people subscribing to these streaming services. Maybe you're going to have a few people that are going to have to cut, some services out because they can't pay for all of them. But the overall amount of people streaming in the US and throughout the world is going to increase by a whole lot in the next couple of years. And that means that there's going to be a lot more traffic through these wireless carriers and these broadband units of these services. And I don't understand Charter's complaint, because it's, if more people are tracking through the internet, or more people are using your service using internet, just increase the cost of bandwidth and internet speed. Or America's pretty much got good internet speed, but bandwidth, just charge per bandwidth. If more households are using or streaming more, then charge more in broadband to offset those fees. I don't know about you, Dustin, but that to me seems like obvious, capitalism, cause and effect, supply and demand. It's just charge more in broadband fees. I think with this rise of new services and more people, subscribing, it's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats situation. Yes, this is obviously going to help these streaming services primarily, as a first order consequence. But a second order consequence is that these broadband units in these companies are going to be more profitable. Just charge more bandwidth fees. But I want to make a distinction here between charging more because supply and demand, and then kind of doing like a net neutrality, like breaking the net neutrality. Although there really isn't net neutrality, but you get the point where Charter is going to charge Disney or Netflix or these other companies to have the same access to the internet as any other business, so they can like rate throttle these services and really affect us, the consumer. If they throttle Netflix, that means that we're going to use less bandwidth, and it's going to save them costs. And that's a path that I think is not advantageous. I think that is a poor business decision, but it might be an answer to this problem of getting more revenue. Or maybe not even getting more revenue, just, keeping the same revenue, or their cost ratio is kind of the same. That is a solution. I think it's a bad solution. And I think that if more more broadband companies with cable units are going to have this pessimistic view where, we're losing cable business. Well, it's like, it just, let it die and increase your broadband. But if you're going to limit the market, the internet place to these streaming services, then that's awful. And you got to mention, right, Charter is, cable and broadband, but they don't own a streaming service that I think of. But AT&T, Comcast, them two have streaming services. And I'm also worried that they might charge extra, per se, throttling the bandwidth of Netflix or Disney or whatever, and basically giving, their service a competitive advantage. So there's a couple ways to think about it, but that's my take. Like, just charge more on broadband fees, and it's going to even out. I don't see what their problem is.
As a consumer, though, I don't think I want that to happen either. I mean, I live in an area where Comcast and AT&T are the two providers there's smaller companies that exist, but those are the companies that have the most reliable service where I am in the Chicagoland area. But the thing for me is, I don't want as somebody who is getting rid of cable, I don't want to then potentially have to pay just as much for my internet as I do for cable and internet, because I'm still getting that content from somewhere else. So while I completely understand the idea of there's no reason you can't raise your price, the other part of it is offer something new. One of the things that has happened in my area, and I think I've mentioned this on a separate episode, is that AT&T has come into the area that I live in, and they've put fiber down. They've spent an enormous amount of money putting fiber throughout neighborhoods in the city that I live in. They spent all last winter spending most of the winter putting in these fiber lines so that every house could have the option of fiber instead of just having the option of either the DSL, which they were currently offering, or the cable internet, which maxes out at, for speed around 200 Mbps. They put in the fiber, and the speeds went in. The difference is insane. It went up almost twice as fast. And that's not even the top option. There's another option that went. But I switched from Comcast over to AT&T for a variety of different reasons. But one of them was that the internet and cable package that they offered was significantly less expensive than the cable and internet package that Comcast was offering. Now, part of that also has to do with the fact that I'm an AT&T wireless subscriber. So that obviously has something to do with it, because you get added discounts because of that. But it is one of those things where I look at it from the value of what has Comcast done as far as upgrading their infrastructure, their services for customers. Nothing. But for price-wise, the price just continuously goes up. Sure, for cable, they might add some channels, But if I'm not using those channels, why am I paying extra for those channels? And that's not to say that AT&T is doing the same thing, because there was just a news report a little while ago that said that AT&T and Comcast are both raising their cable prices yet again after the first of the year. But what I'm saying is, as a customer, you want more value. If you're having to pay more money, you want that money to give you more value. As a customer of Comcast, your prices continuously go up, or you have a promotional rate that expires and then your prices go up to the normal standard rate, which is higher than the promotional rates. And you have to sit there and question yourself as to why are these prices so much higher if I'm not compared to the promotional pricing, but just why are my standard prices going up to a higher standard price when I'm not really getting anything more? It's not that they're increasing the speed of my internet. They're not giving me anything more that I'm actually utilizing. And in most cases, a lot of times, the reason why the price goes up is because of the cable aspect of it and not because of the internet. The cable aspect is because they have to charge more because of the carriage fees for the channels that they carry and a variety of other factors. There's new channels that come on board that specifically are popular enough to warrant being included in the main packages for specific regions. But at the same time, they need to still come up with a way of paying those extra fees for those channels. So what they do is they charge the consumer more money per month, even of course if you're not using those networks or channels. The problem is that as a consumer, that's been the case for years and years and years. You're not getting anything more. And one of the things I've noticed with dealing with Comcast, I was a Comcast customer for 9 years. Before that, I was actually a Charter customer when I lived in Kansas. And where I was in Kansas, I'm not going to sit here and complain about Charter other than it sucked, but there was literally nothing you could do. There was just, that was the option. There wasn't anything you could do.
I love how you're like, yeah, I'm not gonna like throw crap on, Charter, but you just did that.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I know. But I mean, the reality of it is that like it wasn't a good thing, but it wasn't necessarily their fault either. It was just the limit of options where you were. So the internet speed was fine. Wasn't great. At one point, I switched over because I was living on a military base, and that's where Charter was. When I moved off the military base, it was Cox Communications. It was the same exact issue. So it wasn't like moving from one company to another really made any sort of difference whatsoever. It didn't make any difference because it was just the region that I was in just didn't have a great infrastructure in place for that. So when I moved up to Chicago, the infrastructure is here and it exists. And Comcast at the time was the best option because they had better internet speeds and things like that. But then progressively over time, the prices just continuously go up and up and up. And then you're sitting there questioning, how am I paying this much money every single month? And I'm not getting anything more. You go from paying, I think at one point when I started the service, I was paying cable television, phone line and internet. I was paying somewhere in the neighborhood of like $180. And when I canceled my contract with Comcast, I think my price was sitting at the $250 range. It was insane. It went up $70 over 9 years. And I wasn't using anything more or less, or I should say I wasn't using anything more than before, and my internet speed didn't go up. The other thing that was a major change was my internet used to have no cap, and then they implemented caps where you couldn't use more than 2 terabytes per month of data, which for most people is not a problem. Anyway, all of that aside, I eventually went over to AT&T looking not necessarily to switch to cable, television, and phone through them, but to specifically look at the situation of, I was just looking for a different cell phone provider because where I was currently at Sprint, I was having issues. Looking to switch to AT&T, they just randomly mentioned, hey, have you checked out cable or internet? I was like, well, I'm not opposed to changing, but if you don't have at least what I have now and it's not cheaper, then I'm not going to bother switching. And it ended up being significantly cheaper, significantly faster internet, and I get the exact same cable package that I previously had. And when my contract's up next summer, I have every intention of getting, no longer having cable because I don't use it enough to warrant the continuous use of it. There are some shows that I watch, but honestly, once some of these other streaming services launch, those shows will be on the streaming services. So that's what I will watch. But the point of all of this is Comcast's prices continually rise. AT&T raises their prices as well. But if they're not giving you any sort of added value to what you're currently getting, any customer is going to get frustrated with the fact that it's going up in price. There's no, obviously there's just the natural inflation that exists as part of the economy, but But that's not what this is.
There's nothing that the consumer could do besides like drop internet.
Exactly.
If they're going to keep raising the broadband price, then they're going to drop the internet service, which makes sense. I wasn't advocating for that.
Right.
I was looking at through the business end.
Right. From the business side of it, it makes complete sense to.
It makes complete sense.
Right.
Do you know why that? You're talking through your story and you're basically listing like 3 or 4 companies, but really only one operates in your area. Do you know why that is? Why there's like no real competition in a market? It's kind of interesting. It's like how there's only one in a region. Either you have like one state-owned, power company, or you might have like a co-op that works in the area. There's not much competition. One, because it's expensive to like lay out this infrastructure that these companies have laid out throughout years that started with phone lines and then it's kind of evolved from there. Another one is that they allow certain monopolies in America, which I know in America, like you hear the word monopoly and everyone, freaks out, but there's some monopolies or duopolies or whatever they allow because it's kind of like safer, or it's better because you can like control quality and whatnot. So that's become in these markets, like there's not more than 2, suppliers, because you're not going to have the same like consistent service, or you're not going to like redevelop all these roads, every single moment that you're doing that. And so you have these like natural monopolies or duopolies, whatever, show up in these markets. And so like you can't choose a different thing besides like maybe satellite internet, but that's even more ridiculous of a answer. I don't know. If from my perspective, with that lens, like why, if I was the CEO, I would stop complaining and I would just raise the price because the consumer has no other choice. And it's like, if they're going to watch the streaming service, there's no competition in the market and they're not going to leave for a different broadband customer. I mean, unless there's like another person there. So it makes complete sense from there. And I don't understand why he's complaining. From an investor standpoint, there's no reason why he's complaining. And obviously from a consumer standpoint, we don't want that, but that's like a curse of how broadband is, that there's not much competition in broadband like service providers, because of how the things have worked out. So we can't have these companies really fighting for our dollars and offering a cheaper product for us to like get, evolved. Because like in the streaming service space, that's what they're doing. You have all of this competition and we're choosing, and these companies are trying to make the best offer. And that's how come like Disney Plus and Apple really they shocked the investor market. They shocked Wall Street because of how like lowballing they were and how they're trying to get consumers. Whereas in the broadband space, there's only 2 people, and so there's in an area usually, and so you're not gonna. These companies don't have to fight for you, so that means that they can charge whatever they want, and capitalism doesn't really do its thing. So yeah, I don't understand why they're complaining. The people that should be complaining are the streaming services and the people that they raise their money on.
Exactly. And the thing is, it really just comes down to, he really shouldn't be complaining in general, because they've it's almost like they have had the ability to rake in all of this money for years and years and years, and now there's finally something out there that is preventing them from getting money, so they're going to blame it on everybody else except for themselves. The fact that they've set themselves up to this situation where they're specifically in certain regions, there is no sort of competition where they have to be competitive to get customers in general. They've just kind of sat there and relied on the fact that there is no competition for the service that they provide. And now that there's competition when it comes to at least content delivery, such as with the streaming services, they're looking at it and saying, well, of course, this is a bad thing. Everybody should be up in arms because of this. And they still have something that they can offer customers, that they still need to use these services, which is they have the broadband and they have, the customers will need internet one way or the other. AT&T is kind of above and beyond, because if you're not streaming the stuff, if you don't have internet within your house and you just have internet through your cell phone company, they're a cell phone company. And Comcast has Xfinity Mobile, and some of the companies out there, they have other options. But I think a lot of companies who are forward thinking have realized that the future is not necessarily the cable part, which has been the bulk of the revenue stream for multiple decades. Instead, the future is the internet. That's why you see some companies, like my story was earlier about how AT&T is putting fiber lines down in more and more locations, and they're also investing in the 5G aspect for their wireless network. That helps them in the long term, because that is the future of getting revenue. The revenue is where the internet, how to get the internet, and the speeds that you're allowed and the amount of data that you are allotted. That is the future of of these companies making money. It's not on the content delivery part of it.
Yeah, I find it funny how he's complaining and he doesn't have like a streaming service that's, maybe in a competitive market with the other ones like AT&T and, Comcast. AT&T and Comcast. I haven't heard any of, their people really complaining that. I mean, they're complaining about the people losing cable subscribers, but they're not complaining that, those are being taken over. Those streams are being taken by these other streaming services. I think it was like either it was the Warner Media CEO or CTO, or is the AT&T CTO in the there it was on that Recode podcast where he was essentially asked like, is allowing other streaming services good for Warner Media in general due to like broadband stuff and whatnot and its own service? And he basically was like, no, like more competition's good, essentially like driving kind of what we said about the broadband business, like that's going to help that, but then also it doesn't really hurt them. And it was an interesting response between somebody that's at a company that has cable broadband content delivery versus just this like cable company, where I think the Warner Media CTO I think has a more valid reason to be upset, but the Charter CEO I think he's got less of a leg to stand on.
Yeah, I think it just comes
a weird article. It's just like a weird time. I'm just confused.
Really, I mean, if I was an investor and I was hearing him say this, I would think to myself, okay, it's time to get out of this company and into maybe another cable provider if you're looking to stay within the same industry, because they're not looking at things from a forward. They're not looking at things like in a future momentum. They're looking at things of how can we explain what's happening, but not address these things. This, it's saying that streaming services, which they have absolutely no control over, need to go out there and be more vigilant about the password sharing as a problem. That's a problem that we already know the streaming services are trying to solve and trying to figure out, but that's not something that a cable company has any part of. There's no part of a cable company being part of that, unless of course they have a streaming service that's underneath their corporate umbrella. The thing is, it just comes across as like, hey, I don't have an explanation as to why we're losing subscribers. I don't have an explanation as to how we're going to keep our revenue up despite the fact that we're losing all these people. So I'm going to make an excuse. And the excuse is password sharing. And that's a problem for a CEO as their explanation behind something. And that it's just not forward thinking. And that's not a company, at least I'd want to be involved in. And I'm not sitting here telling you to invest or not invest. We're not doing any of that. But I'm just saying, like, somebody who's at the top of the company should be forward thinking, not just looking at figuring out a way to make an excuse as to why they're losing revenue. The AT&T, their entire business model, and one of the things that they're focusing on very much so right now is that they are looking at HBO Max as the way to replace a lot of what they're doing with the other content cable delivery stuff that they have. They know DirecTV is failing. They know that cable television as a whole is failing. They're putting more effort into keeping their wireless customers by offering HBO Max as a free premium content for their provider or for their customers. They're also looking at enhancing their networks in general, whether it be through fiber expansion or whether it be through 5G investment. So these are things that constantly come up too whenever they're talking about HBO Max and saying like, this is important because of this, because the backside of this is we will make money off of the broadband customers. We will make money off of the customers, the wireless customers, because they will still need the data to watch this content. You don't need the data to watch the content through a cable provider. That's why. So like I'll end on this. Okay, I've given AT&T and Warner Brothers, I've said this before, I've given them a lot of crap about how it doesn't feel like they're all in, when in reality they are all in, but just in not the same sense as some of these other services. They're looking at it from a perspective of HBO Max is their answer to keeping the churn, which they've said, and we've talked about before, keeping their churn levels down when it comes to wireless customers, when it comes to their broadband customers, because if they offer this service to those customers, it gives a reason for those customers to stay, but it keeps those customers paying those other bills. And that is something we're seeing a lot. I mean, Verizon, there was an article recently that said Verizon was blown away by the success of the deal that they made with Disney to offer their customers Disney Plus for free for 12 months. Well, no surprise, because again, Verizon, sure, they're paying Disney for it, maybe at a discounted rate, but they're paying Disney for that. But it's keeping the customers that they have from leaving the service because they have that. Now, after the 12 months, that'll be a whole different story. But that's what it is. A lot of these cable providers or wireless companies, they're looking at keeping their customers long term, and they're trying to figure out the ways to keep their customers. And AT&T is doing that by, putting a lot of money into HBO Max as a service that could make some money on the ad delivery once they eventually get to that side of it. But ultimately, their whole point is to keep the money when it comes to making money on the broadband and the wireless transactions that they already have in place with customers, with their large customer base that they have across the country. So that's what's most important. And in general, this Spectrum Charter, they're realizing that there's not a lot of opportunities to move forward. Sure, like Tony said, they could switch and start charging more for their broadband, and that could help. But long term, that's not going to. There's no way that their entire broadband amount per customer is going to exceed what they're currently paying for broadband and cable, and that's just something that all these companies are dealing with right now. So it's interesting to see a CEO kind of go off the rails and say, yes, this is a problem, and it's not anything that I have a solution for, but I have an excuse as to why it's happening. It's anybody but our own fault.
Yeah, if I'll end on this. If the CEO is not going to be forward thinking over the long haul, the best option for them is just to sell their company to like AT&T or Comcast, to somebody bigger, and to just be a part of that money making machine for them. And if you're not going to be forward thinking, then just sell and move on. I guess that's my take. It's like you're going to complain, either innovate or die. It's evolution.
It is. All right. So with that being said, I want to encourage everybody to head over to the website, check out the release calendar for all the content that is available on all of the variety of different streaming services. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Discord for all the latest articles that we talk about here on the podcast, and even some that we don't get around to talking about on the podcast. As well as you can follow us on Instagram for all latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast releasing. You can leave us reviews on any of the podcast platforms that you currently listen to them on. This podcast is available on a variety of podcast services, including it's available on Pandora and YouTube as well. So be sure to check us out over on either one of those platforms, or continue to listen to us wherever you are currently listening to us. In addition to that, you can get in touch with us at thestreamingwars@gmail.com. With all of that being said, we hope you guys are enjoying your holidays, and we will see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.